Hey, good morning all. I come to you as your favorite second grade teacher from the 90s apparently, because today we unfortunately need to have a little chat about book reviews. And this is a kind of cyclical discourse, as a lot of things become cyclical discourse, and I am not pretending by any means that I am the first one to wade into these waters. This is well-trod territory, to mix metaphors. To be fair, your second grade teacher probably didn't teach you about metaphors anyway. So why are we going here again? I have been noticing an uptick not only in this conversation resurfacing, but in bad takes from multiple people regarding how reviews should be handled by readers and reviewers, as well as bad behavior from authors stemming from reviews. As the line between reader and writer spaces has become more frayed, and as writers have become largely responsible for their own publicity regarding their books, this has become a more complicated and more prevalent issue. Readers and writers are all allowed their spaces, absolutely, but how we navigate those spaces is different, and there's not a one-size-fits-all matter to things. For instance, some authors like being tagged in positive reviews. Some authors don't want to be invited into reader-only spaces at all. The only thing we can pretty much all agree on, I say pretty much for like outliers, we really should agree on this. Don't tag authors in your negative reviews. What is that about? What are you doing? And while it's best practice and just manners, honestly, not to tag authors in bad reviews, that does not mean that bad reviews can't exist or shouldn't exist. And recently we've been seeing some takes both about, one, questioning why bad takes and bad reviews are so prevalent, and also we've seen some takes arguing that bad reviews, whatever you consider that 1-star, 2-star, shouldn't exist at all, which is a take I flatly don't agree with for many reasons, and we're gonna open that discussion and have that discussion here, so feel free to chat with me as we kind of talk through this. And sure, as a creative, you don't want bad reviews. It's never easy to hear criticism or pleasant to hear criticism, and again, as those lines between reader and writer spaces, especially on places like TikTok, where it's harder to avoid certain things, it becomes harder than by default to avoid those bad reviews. And there is a large press for authors and creatives to be on places like TikTok in order to get any kind of traction. So that is a valid kind of conversation, I think. However, arguing against the existence of bad reviews is not the proper take. And here's the deal. We're living in a kind of world now where the average reader is the kind of largest source of reviews. I don't personally seek out trade reviews. I will read a review in a large paper if it's from someone that I'm interested in hearing their take on something. For instance, I will often read Brandon Taylor's reviews if I know that he has written a review for something. So I think that there is a little bit more tension as reviews from the average person become more central to everything, because you can't control what the average person, or any person really. The large papers haven't always gotten it right. Trade publications definitely haven't always gotten it right. But there's some level of editorializing there as well. And then you can take your complaint to the institution rather than to, the masses. But there is sometimes a level of you don't get it or you don't understand to these reviews. And we're gonna dig into the nuances of that for sure. But I do think it kind of aligns with, I'm going to the art museum later today with a friend. I am not knowledgeable on visual art. I know like the very basics of the schools of art, but I can't really speak to technique or skill in the same way that my friend Dana can, because she studied art and she knows art. I'm just kind of more in it for the historical connections and feeling connected to times and people and places that I have no access to and never will. However, even with my lack of knowledge, I am still able to have emotional reactions to works of art. And whether I can eloquently explain those reactions or not, my reactions are still valid. Now, if I were to go and respond to these works of art in some other platform, you can decide how you are going to interact with that review based on my knowledge base. And I think the current review landscape is very much that. We have different levels of reader, and not levels in a way that it's a natural progression, but people who approach text differently, people who really enjoy digging in, analyzing, annotating, people who just want to read and have that kind of emotional wave and then move on to the next thing. We have people who have been reading for decades and people who have just gotten back into reading or gotten into reading really for the first time. We have this wide breadth of experience, which is actually really exciting because then we're able to approach these works from so many different angles that before we would never have access to. And the blunt truth of the matter is that not everyone is going to react to a work in the same way. Not everyone is going to appreciate a work. I actually personally trust reviews less, and I've heard this echoed from other people as well, if it is only glowing reviews, because to me that means that it hasn't really reached a broad audience, that it has to be taken with a grain of salt, because the truth, as I've said, of the matter is that not everyone is going to like a work. And as an author, that stinks. That's hard because you are crafting these worlds in isolation. You have the full context of the story you're telling. You know these people, these places, these actions, their motivations. There's an emotional feeling to this world and this work to you, and there is an inherent kind of internal logic because you know all of the things and how they go together. And then you have to put it into the world, and it is going to be read and interpreted by people who may kind of recognize that internal logic that rings true to you and was shaped by you, or it may not. And you as a creative have to decide if you're even going to engage with those reviews and those thoughts, and two, if you find them valid. For those of you who are newer to this space, one, thanks for hanging out, but two, you may have noticed that I talk about books every Friday, and I don't really approach it from a stars angle because I want to go in to these books as conversations and kind of explore what I think works, what I was excited by, what maybe didn't work as well for me, but without all of the kind of baggage of what the star rating system represents. And there are works that I've really enjoyed, and there are works that I haven't so much enjoyed. And when I first started out, I kind of thought I was going to take the approach of only talking about things I liked. And even with things I like, that doesn't mean I'm not going to critique it. If you've been here for a second, you'll recognize, maybe, hopefully, that even if I like something, I will talk about the bits that maybe didn't land as well for me. And I ultimately decided that this was valuable because, one, it reflects the reality of my reading existence. While I'm excited and eager to champion books that I am excited about, that I think deserve attention, that I think people would like, I am not the publicist for a publisher. So my goal at the end of the day is not to sell you a book, but to talk about a book with you. And also, if I don't tell you what doesn't land for me, what I don't like, or what doesn't resonate as much for me, how can you then get a sense of how you align with my taste? Because my taste is not going to be your taste. And if our tastes are different, you know what, that's okay. Part of being in this online space and in the book community is finding people that kind of align with your tastes and seeking those reviews out, but also maybe finding people that don't align with your tastes and knowing that and taking what they say with a grain of salt, but listening anyway. Or just being able to listen to a review and a conversation and form your own opinion. On my own book chats, there are people that agree or disagree with my own take or enjoyment of a book, and that's okay because your enjoyment of a book is not reliant on my enjoyment of a book. Why would it be? So thus, my review, my conversation may help give you a sense of something before you go in, if that's what you're interested in, or be part of a larger conversation after. And I think conversations about books are so exciting because, again, we all experience them so differently. Because just as a writer is in their own head when they're writing it, we as readers are in our own heads when we're reading it. We're experiencing it in a way that only we can experience it. We're bringing in all of our own personal context and life experience and sometimes baggage to that reading, and that is going to shape how we see it. Now, how I've personally decided to discuss books here is shaped by a lot of things. And again, none of this is either right or wrong. First, my background. So in theater, my theater background, I am a dramaturg. This is a role that wears many hats, but one of those hats deals with new play development. So I have worked with playwrights that are shaping a piece or putting up a play, whether that is a first draft and reacting to a first draft, reading for developmental opportunities for either theaters or workshops, working on workshop readings or productions where you have a kind of limited stage reading to kind of get a sense of how that play sounds up on its feet, or a full production with talkbacks afterwards where there is less control. And this role can be kind of considered parallel to an editor in terms of conceptualization. Sometimes they are vastly different roles. One of the main differences being that dramaturgs do not really have editorial power. We are not changing things in a script for a playwright. Depending on the playwright's relationship with their dramaturg, there may be more trusting, kind of developed relationships that allow for a little bit more freedom there. But mainly as a dramaturg, we're posing questions. We're one, looking at a piece and trying to understand what the playwright wants to get across, and two, looking to see if the pieces of the play as they stand serve that purpose, serve the story the playwright is trying to tell. And if there are moments that I feel as a dramaturg don't serve the story or throw me as a potential audience member out of something, because we are both looking and approaching the work as this kind of literary side of things, but also as an audience member, as someone from the outside that doesn't have the inner workings of the play, we can pose questions and be like, how did you intend for this to read? This is how it's reading to me, or this is how I'm perceiving it. Are you okay with that? Is this serving what you want me as an audience member to be feeling or thinking at this moment? It's a lot of open-ended questions and conversation, kind of guiding. It's not as prescriptive, and I definitely think that has translated into some of these conversations. Now, that's not saying that as a reader of books, there are not things that I read and I'm like, I did not like that. I really did not enjoy that, would not recommend. Case in point, The Notebook. I didn't like The Notebook. The end. But I'm a little bit more likely to approach it from a conversational angle. One, because I'm interested in that discussion. I'm interested in talking with others about how they saw something, what they thought, because I'm well aware that I'm bringing my own kind of perspective to things. That being said, I will absolutely yell and complain and joke about books that I didn't like, often, like in book club or to my friends. I'm not above that. I would never pretend I am. And I personally sometimes enjoy reading those snarky or negative reviews. I'm also not saying I've never written a snarky negative review in my life. That would also be a lie. But I also like to stay away from committing to star ratings a lot of the time. Keep in mind, this is coming from someone who has been on Goodreads since I believe March of 2007, but wasn't actively adding people as friends or using the kind of social aspect of the site until like the mid 2010s. I was really using it as my own personal reading log. And I remember switching from like my school reading logs to Goodreads and being really excited by the star ratings. But those star ratings can shift with time. Case in point, the Bridgerton series. When I first read it when I was a teenager, I think The Viscount Who Loved Me was one of my least favorite in the series, and An Offer from a Gentleman was one of my favorites. Those have completely flipped as my life experience and my context have grown and changed. And I enjoy seeing how those ratings grow and change for myself. However, the star system has become its own beast at this point and is part of the publicity conundrum I think we're in, where readers are kind of the main publicity for a book. Ratings get books more views. It bumps them up in the algorithm. The more people reading a book, rating a book, liking that book, the more likely that book is to get pushed out more, picked up by more people, talked about online. And thus the performance and the success of that book really depends on those star ratings. And I do not think that that is fair. I understand how it's happened, how it's morphed that way, why it's happened, because as readers, we want to spend our time on things we think we're going to enjoy. That's why reader reviews exist pretty much in the first place. One, we want to talk about what we're reading, we want to engage with the work, we want to have conversations with like-minded people, but two, we are kind of seeking out this assurance that our limited time is being spent well, especially now when, even though we often talk about how hard it is to get published, which is undoubtedly true, and there is a lot of work that goes into it, and it's labor intensive from all sides of the spectrum, whether you're being traditionally published, independently published, self-published. It is not easy, and I would never pretend it is. However, as readers, we are facing more options and titles than probably ever, and there is just the reality that we're not going to get to everything. And often these star ratings then become a kind of default to kind of sort things out. Now, again, I have my own problems with these ratings. For instance, like when we had the Amazon bookstore, which I didn't like, and part of the reason I didn't like it is that it felt so impersonal. It was being curated by AI, and that AI was being determined, and that curation was being determined by star ratings. And so then you were seeing the kind of most popular, broadest appealing titles in the store, and there wasn't just that individuality and curation. So the star ratings in and of themselves are kind of the broadest baseline indicator. And I've personally, as a reader in the last couple of years, had to pull away from using those as a metric because I've realized that they don't really lend themselves to accurate reflections with things like more experimental fiction, things that have a much smaller, more niche audience than something more broadly appealing. To be as vague as possible, clearly. So then we get into reviews that go beyond the star rating themselves, whether it be written, whether it be video, whether here or on TikTok, you know, wherever. And even here, it is kind of undeniable that the negative reviews are kind of the most engaged with. One, negativity is often rewarded by social media regardless. So those things kind of float to the top. And that is not a critique on the negative reviews themselves, because there is a great catharsis if you have really disliked something in kind of airing those grievances. Case in point, I really hated the Artemis Fowl movie. I thought it was a disservice to the book series I loved as a child. I aired those grievances and I felt much better. And as I've heard other creators echo, it is often easier to keep track of those grievances than to articulate why you responded to something. I remember in high school when my teacher was like trying to get us to explain why we liked a book. And I was really pushing against that. I was like, I just liked it. Why can't I just like something? I wasn't at the skill level where I could articulate why I liked something. And even now, it is hard to talk about why I liked something. Because if you liked something, if it's done well, or even if it was just the right book for you at the right time, you were so sucked in that you often lose sight of the scaffolding. And that is purposeful and great. That means that you are fully enmeshed in that world. And that's a beautiful experience and what I think we're all seeking as readers, what we all want. So it's harder to be as precise about why we liked something than why we didn't like something. And so then it's easier to have conversations and kind of pick apart those pieces of why we didn't like something, whether we agree or disagree, because we have these kind of points to discuss or talk about even, and then we are engaging more. That feeds into the algorithm, you know, the whole snowball effect. But wanting to get rid of negative reviews, saying that we should only talk about what we like, while I think is born of a good place, I don't think it's born of being contrarian just to be contrarian. Rather, this idea of there is so much out there, right? There's so much to pick from. Why would we waste our time on something we didn't like when we could be forwarding something we did, supporting something we did? Which does go back to the fact that as readers, we are not the publicity team. And it also feeds into this larger trend of toxic positivity, this idea that we should only be positive about things, only seeking out the positive. However, that isn't good either, because then we ignore very real problems, whether they be systematic, whether they be personal, but the idea that we should be able to engage actively with texts. And even removed from the idea of actual harm caused by books, discussing what we didn't like or what didn't sit well with us or didn't work for us helps push the craft and the art forward in different ways. Additionally, if we only have good reviews, whether they be connected to stars or not, that is going to water down reviews, period. How can readers trust a review if they're only hearing about good things, what people like, and it's not balanced out by what didn't land for some people? And again, this is talking more about the review and book ecosystem as a whole, rather than like what specific content creators do with their own content. For instance, there are book influencers and reviewers that I follow from like the early book influencer days that only talk about what they're excited about and what they have positively responded to. And that's great, because that's how they are most comfortable interacting with books and how they've decided to use their platform. And then I can go to other places or seek out other sources if I want another perspective on a book. Because personally, sometimes I love reading those glowing reviews of a book and the less than glowing reviews and seeing where I fall, which is usually somewhere in the middle. And all of that really feeds into the fact that at the end of the day, reviews are still subjective. We are talking about our own very personal responses, journeys, interactions to a work. And we're not going to all agree on everything. Now, can certain reactions to differing opinions for certain works become a little bit more combative than other works? Absolutely. That's a whole different conversation. But a negative review, a positive review in and of themselves are both reviews. They're both talking about a work. And if we take the negative review out of the equation wholesale, it's going to water everything down. The positive review then becomes less effective as well. And there can often be a, well, have you ever written a book mindset to things? Which I understand that kind of emotional kind of impetus, that reaction, because crafting something like this is so personal. but I haven't, and I don't want to. And I think that having that outside perspective, I am a reader through and through, helps in my responses as well. I'm not looking at things as a writer, I'm looking at things as a reader. And at the end of the day, some people just aren't good writers. Some people just aren't good writers, and that stinks. I want everyone to be good at everything, but there are a lot of things I'm not good at. And with that, not everyone is guaranteed literary success. In fact, it is the outlier. And that stinks, it does, because it is so hard to get into the game in the first place. And the sad fact of the matter is there are so many amazing, talented writers that aren't getting the recognition they deserve. There are so many books to choose from. There are so many things to read. There are so many things that I personally want to read, that reviews and the whole spectrum of reviews are necessary. And sure, readers are going to interact with reviews much differently. Some people may heavily research a book and look at reviews before picking a book up, and some people may not even look at a review until after they're finished to then kind of jump into the conversation. But regardless of how readers interact with reviews, the fact of the matter is those reviews are for readers. And thus, readers get to decide what is helpful for them in their reading journey, because while reviews can ultimately help a book's publicity, that is not the main goal of a review. And in this world where there's this fraying again at the edges, reviews are inherently reader spaces and should remain that way. So again, help keep them that way and stop tagging those authors in negative reviews, because most authors recognize that reviews are for readers. They understand. And even when it is hard to stay away from reviews, because at heart most writers are also readers, it's hard to stay away from a review that is so close to you when you are used to engaging with reviews, but most understand the dynamic and respect it, and that cannot be stressed enough. And authors, at the end of the day, if you're still struggling, let's just have a quick chat. Pretend I'm your dramaturg, I guess. You've done something huge, incredibly difficult, and you should be proud. You have crafted this thing that was in your head and you have put it out into the world. And there is a great vulnerability in putting something that has been so personal to you out into the world. And I recognize that that puts you in a very vulnerable place. And that's hard, because criticism is hard. It's hard to see this thing that has lived inside of you, that you know the inside and outside intricacies of, being picked up and taken by readers, and you can't control how those readers are going to perceive the thing. That's the sad truth. I get it. It's hard. This thing that you've created, that you've helped nurture into the world, isn't your thing anymore. It's got a life of its own now, and you have to let it live that life. And it can be hard not to want to wrestle back control of that thing, of the narrative, of your story, by engaging with reviews in whatever way. Because as I said before, creation is incredibly personal, but also as I said before, reading is incredibly personal. And you have to let that thing be the readers now. Some of them are gonna get it, they're gonna be on board. Some of them won't. And unfortunately, you can't control how the ratio of that is gonna play out. The only thing that you can control is how you're gonna interact with those reviews. And I don't mean like engaging with them or telling people not to post negatively, but whether you are going to seek reviews out, period, at all, first. And two, if you do, how you are going to think about those negative reviews. Are you going to read them and take the critique in them at face value? Are you going to think about it and implement it if you decide it's worthy? Are you going to ignore it if you decide it's not worthy? Because at the end of the day, the same way that a playwright can ignore a note from me because they decide that what they have is serving what they envisioned, you can do the same. But you also have to determine if what you've written is being interpreted in the way you meant, if you're engaging with that. So that's gonna be up to you. My personal stance on the matter is that reviews aren't there to make someone a better writer. So you can only decide what you think is working or not based on how that review is reading, but the reviewer's job is not to give you constructive criticism either. So avoid the reviews or sit with them however you need to, but at the end of the day, remember that they're for the readers. And honestly, any discussion, any review is helping forward the conversation around the work. And if the conversation is negative, that stinks. I'm so sorry. Criticism is hard. I'm not pretending that criticism doesn't stink, that it's uncomfortable. I'm sure I've made decisions. I know I've made decisions to avoid criticism, so I get it. But ultimately, just let that thing live in the world as it is at this point, because that's all part of the artistic process. And speaking of the artistic process, I've got to go look at some art. So thanks for hanging out with me today and listening to my thoughts. Leave yours below. This is obviously a conversation, and unfortunately a conversation that I'm sure will continue to cyclically pop up, but let's just chat it out. So like and subscribe if you feel like it, read something good most importantly, and yeah, bye.